Turn on the TV anytime, day or night, and you can watch the news. But whose agenda determines the stories you see and the stories you don't? Tonight, we'll talk about a special endeavor by EWTN to bring you the day-to-day news from a Christian worldview. News that the secular press often ignores. So please stay with us. Thank you very much. I'm Father Mitch, and this is EWTN Live, which is our chance to bring you guests from all over the world. Before we get to our guest, I want to mention that today is the feast of Saint Sixtus II. He was elected Pope in 257 AD. He only reigned 1 year. And on this date, in 258 AD, he was caught by the Roman police because the Emperor Valerian had made it a law. Any bishop, priest, or deacon that was caught was immediately to be executed. And so he got caught while celebrating Mass with some deacons at one of the catacombs and was executed right away. And 3 days later, his deacon, St. Lawrence, was also caught. And we'll celebrate him in a few days. So we want to especially pray for Pope Francis and for all of the successors of Peter, that they might stay firm in the faith like St. Sixtus did, and that the Lord would protect them. Now, in terms of today's show, there is no doubt that the news stories that the secular media covers and the ways they cover them speak of their behind-the-scenes agenda and attempts to shape the way we think about the world around us and the issues of our day. Is it any wonder why you did not see any coverage of the Gosnell trial on the major news networks? Only one major news organization finally picked it up after thousands of complaints about their silence. And this is only one of the many examples that caused EWTN to step forward beginning next month with a bold new effort to bring you the news. Check it out.
EWTN News Nightly is an exciting new arrival in the world of television news. We'll bring you a Catholic analysis of the day's big events, 5 nights a week, with a news team dedicated to covering the topics that matter to us all, the top stories, the significant issues within the church and around the globe. We'll ask the questions that others don't. We'll cover the stories that others won't. And we believe this is one news program that everyone, not just Catholics, will want to watch.
Joining us now via satellite from the studios of EWTN News Nightly in Washington, D.C., please welcome Colleen Carroll Campbell.
Thank you, Father.
Now, I usually introduce this program by mentioning that we bring guests from all around the world, but usually they're here in the studio. This is one of the rare interviews we've done via satellite. So this is a little bit of a learning scale for me, but hopefully you're much more adept at this. Now, Coleen, you have been working in the news media, or what is your background to be involved in this new endeavor?
Sure. Well, Father Mitch, thanks again for having me. And most of my journalism background is actually with the secular press, mainstream media. I was a news reporter and then an editorial writer and eventually an op-ed columnist for several newspapers. I started out of college at the Memphis Commercial Appeal and then moved to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, where I was for a number of years. I took off some time on a journalism fellowship to write my first book, The New Faithful, then came back and I worked as a speechwriter for President Bush, so that was a detour out of journalism. But it eventually went back to being an op-ed columnist and, of course, doing TV punditry, and then wrote another book, my new one, My Sisters the Saints. So I've been in a couple different ends of the news spectrum, but I kind of started in the hard news, the shoe leather reporting, and I've seen a lot of the secular press from the inside, as well as contributing to the Catholic press. So I think I have a sense of the need that's there, and I think you described it well. I think it's important that we think about the sources where we're getting our news, and we really feel this new EWTN News Nightly is going to fill an important gap in the news coverage that Catholics are able to get.
Coleen, we mentioned at the beginning of the program that we suspect there is a certain agenda in terms of the stories that are focused on and the ones that are neglected. So the Kermit Gosnell story was very much neglected by most of the media. And other cases, especially a number of sensational murder cases, are covered ad nauseum. And I just wonder, did you hear people in the news organizations where you worked in the secular media talking about their principles for editing out, the various stories, things they wanted to cover, things they didn't want to cover? How does that process of choosing take place? And is there a bias?
Well, I'd say there definitely is a bias, but I think it's important, too, to understand that a lot of times the bias is one that isn't very obvious to the reporters and editors who are operating under it. Mm-hmm. So what you get is often all types of diversity in a newsroom, except the one that perhaps matters most, and that is ideological diversity. So you have a group of people who think the same, see the world from the same point of view. We saw a study years ago, a famous study that came out in the 80s showing that something like 93% of journalists didn't consider themselves religious or ever go to church, as opposed to the American public very lopsidedly the other direction. And so there is a sense in which the religiously informed worldview isn't very familiar to many journalists in the secular media. So a lot of the lapses in coverage we see, a lot of the stories that don't get covered and should, or that get covered in a way that we considered skewed, sometimes that's an obvious attempt at spinning the story, absolutely. But a lot of times it's simply the result of groupthink, a large group of people who are all seeing the world from a very secular point of view, not really realizing there are other angles to this story, or this may matter to people even though it doesn't kind of register with my worldview. And so I think that's what happened with the Gosnell trial. Big story, obviously, from any point of view, but I think it was overlooked in part perhaps to shore up the pro-abortion rights side in terms of Gosnell obviously being an embarrassment to that cause, but also just out of a sense of blinders. I don't see that story because that doesn't register with my worldview, and there's no one in the newsroom to challenge me. And so you'll often hear from faithful Catholics in secular newsrooms that they feel outnumbered, and not so much because people are out to get them or out to get the faith, but because they just aren't a lot of colleagues who share their way of looking at the world, and that's reflected in the stories we see when we pick up the newspaper in the morning or turn on the TV in the evening. And that's the gap, I think, that we want to try to address with EWTN News Nightly.
Some years ago, back when I first started in radio, and before I came to EWTN, I was doing radio in Nashville, Tennessee, at an evangelical station, doing a Catholic show on this Protestant evangelical station. And they sent me to report on a large Christian broadcasters conference at the Grand Ole Opry Hotel and Convention Center. And one of the most interesting lectures was by a professional secular news reporter from Reuters, who told the Christians who were there, they were almost, I think I was one of the very few Catholics that was at the place, and they told them that there's a major difference in worldview in that religious people assume faith in God, Scripture, and many other things, whereas secular reporters assume almost cynicism. They question everything, and there's a sense that nothing should be believed until it can be proven. And he was trying to point that out as a clash of cultures. Does that resonate with your experience?
Well, I would say that journalists can be known for their cynicism, and certainly a certain amount of skepticism is healthy on the job, even if you are a person of faith, because you're checking politicians, making sure what they say is actually true, checking the facts. You know, the old slogan, I think Reagan used it, but it's just as true for journalists. If your mother says she loves you, check it out. So I think in some sense that's just part of the DNA of a journalist, Catholic or otherwise. But I think it is true that there's almost a knee-jerk skepticism about religion on the part of many secular reporters and editors. And again, sometimes this comes from a lack of familiarity with that world. It's just completely foreign. And so a lot of the stories that you see about religion in the secular press sort of look at religious people as if they're sort of beetles under a microscope. You know, these odd little creatures. Aren't they interesting how they actually bow down to this and believe that? And so there can be a lack of ability to sort of empathize with people of faith and understand where they're coming from. And really, as a journalist, that's your job, to try to understand where someone's coming from, even if you disagree with them, even if you want to make sure you're also showing, obviously, those with whom they're in conflict. But again, I think that's where the blinders come, and I think that's where, I'd like to see more diversity across our media landscape, but I think this show can be a good start toward that.
Yeah. Now, of course, this new news program is not the first time our EWTN audience will have seen you. You have a popular TV series called Faith and Culture, and you also hosted some of EWTN's conclave coverage back in March of this year, 2013. And you're on camera when the white smoke came out signaling the election of the new Holy Father, Pope Francis. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it was obviously an amazing experience to be there, both waiting for the white smoke, and then when the white smoke came out, and announcing Pope Francis to the world, and then anchoring the coverage of his installation mass. So it was just a whirlwind time, and I was so honored that I could be the one to anchor that coverage. And it was just really inspiring to me as a Catholic. You know, there often aren't many times as a journalist where you can really be fully present in your faith and in your work, and that was just a wonderful experience personally, to be in Rome, to hear those crowds, and then to hear how they quieted when Pope Francis called them to prayer, this man of simplicity, this Jesuit, Father Mitch, and also a man who took this Franciscan name and really that Franciscan charism as well of simplicity. So it was just truly inspiring, and it was also wonderful to be there with my family. My husband and 3 young children were able to come to Rome with me for that time. So my toddlers were romping through the square thinking seeing the Pope is just something you do every day in Rome, kind of like going to the neighborhood parks. So we all had a wonderful experience, and it was truly, truly memorable and uplifting.
Oh, that's great. And, you know, one of the things certainly that we'd want to ask you about, what kind of stories are you going to be looking for? I mean, what kind of range, as a matter of fact, that might be a better way to put it, what is going to be the range of stories that you want to cover? Will you be including, say, some of the murder trials that everybody else covers or things like that? Or what approach you want to take?
Well, obviously, we're not going to put the same focus on some of the more sensationalist stories that other networks do. And that's one nice thing about being part of a network like EWTN. We're not beholden to corporate interests to try to put something up there we think will draw eyes no matter what the quality. We do have the freedom to really pursue the stories that are the most important ones, but also interesting ones, and good storytelling is obviously important to us. Again, we'll cover the issues that are very important to Catholics, both in the United States, but also around the world. You know, some of the hot-button social issues, of course, and the battles over defense of life and marriage and all of that, religious freedom. But we also want to look at a lot of the issues that don't get a lot of attention, and issues where there's a lot of room for prudential judgment among Catholics. We're very open with this newscast. This is coming from a Catholic worldview, and we're not ashamed of that, and we're very clear about that. In fact, in some ways, we're a lot more honest than most networks who have their own agenda but don't declare what it is. Ours is, we want to show our viewers the world from a Catholic perspective and show them the stories that matter to them as Catholics. And we want it to be a broad enough newscast that it'll appeal to many who are not in the Catholic Church, but just want to see good stories and good storytelling and find out what's really going on some of these topics where they're not seeing a lot of coverage. The other piece we really want to bring to this is top-notch analysis from a Catholic point of view of a lot of these issues where, again, there's prudential judgment, room for differences among faithful Catholics about, for instance, the best way to deal with foreign policy, the best approach to budgets, the size of the social welfare state, the pros and cons of hiking or lowering taxes. All of these things, you know, there isn't one Catholic answer to these things. There are some quite vigorous debates to be had, and we want to have those on EWTN News Nightly and have them with top-of-the-line commentators and experts who really know what they're doing and still are looking at the world through an authentically Catholic point of view. So this isn't going to be a propaganda show or simply a bunch of puff pieces. We want to dig into the tough issues and the issues where sometimes things are a little murky, even with your catechism in hand, and we really want to explore those for our viewers and with our viewers. So I think it's going to be a true resource for Catholics and Christians and all people of goodwill who've been looking for an intelligent news program that's going to help them make sense of the world and going to dig a little deeper into stories that we just don't see covered enough or covered particularly well on some of these more difficult topics.
I have two more questions. One, I'd like you to respond to. Will you have access to, say, the presidential press briefings, congressional and Senate briefings, and other contacts with people in the federal government and or state governments?
We certainly will. We're just steps from the Capitol, so we're in the heart of the action or the belly of the beast, depending on your point of view, Father Mitch. But we're right here. We've got a crew of energetic reporters, researchers, producers ready to tackle the world. And we are going to cover well beyond the Beltway. This isn't just a show about the ins and outs of Washington, because we know that there's a lot more life beyond Washington than sometimes you would know from watching some of the cable networks. But we are going to be on top of the political scene here and, getting in there wherever there are debates to be had that are important to Catholics. And as Catholics, in fact, we should be interested in a whole lot of things that are going on in Washington for good and ill. We're going to be there. We're lining up our credentials. And again, we're in a great location where we can really be in the heart of the action and keep tabs on the folks who are given the public trust and see what they're doing with it.
My second question is somewhat related, and that is, what kind of international reporting will you have, or do you plan? How are you going to cover some of those stories around the world?
Sure. Well, we do have an active Rome bureau already with EWTN, which was obviously our home base during the coverage of the election of Pope Francis. And so our reporter Alan Holdren and others there are already scouting for good stories and really keeping a tab on what's happening in Rome, around the Vatican. Unlike a lot of networks, we don't just drop in whenever there's a conclave. We're there all the time. So we're able to really bring some exclusives and some really interesting stories on a regular basis straight from our Rome bureau. We also are working in cooperation with the Associated Press to be able to get footage and on-the-spot news coverage of things happening around the world that Catholics need to be kept abreast of. So again, it's going to be a mix of news from around the world, but also meaty commentary about what's happening in both far-flung places and, again, right here in Washington on some of these debates that we hear talked about so much, but so many times on cable TV, at least, there's more heat than light shed by some of the commentary, and we really want this to be rich commentary, interesting, but substantive, too, something you can sink your teeth into and something intelligent where you actually walk away and can say, I learned something new today. And I saw that from a different perspective than I didn't see anywhere else. That's really our goal here at EWTN News Nightly. We're just starting out, so we're catching up in terms of the learning curve, but we're really excited about what we have planned and excited about the wide open possibilities, both of our location, our team, and just this opportunity that EWTN has given us to really bring something fresh and bold and new to our viewers.
Now, you mentioned your team. What kind of team do you have? What's your staff like?
Well, we're a growing staff, but we have researchers and folks booking guests. We have reporters going out in the field, both around Washington, and then, as I mentioned, we also have the use of the Rome Bureau, which is helpful, a staffed Rome Bureau. We have producers and kind of producers up the line. So we have a solid team. It's still a growing team. Very energetic, very excited about what's happening here, working hard for the last few months, getting things ready. There's a lot of energy and enthusiasm and a real sense that we have the opportunity to do something path-breaking here. That's a real joy as a journalist to be a part of it. Again, I mentioned that most of my background is in the secular media, and a lot of the commentary I still do. I'll do a blog post for the New York Times or Washington Post or whatever, and it's great to be in the mix in those environments, even when you're sort of the minority voice, as I usually am. But there's something really unique about being able to sink your teeth into something like this show, where you can be open and authentic about your Catholic perspective and yet still mix it up on the big debates of the day and have a lot of room for creativity, for finding stories others aren't finding, and for delving into things that you've wanted to learn about and you've wanted to see covered for years and you didn't see them covered somewhere else. And now we have the opportunity to do some of that thanks to the resources we have here. So this is a very exciting time for us, and we're really hoping this is going to be a show that our EWTN viewers will tune into from the very first day, September 3rd, and also that will welcome new viewers to our network through this newscast.
One, I guess, a question, it goes back to something I asked before, in regard to being present at, say, the presidential press meetings. They have a daily press meeting with the press representative from the White House. Will you be able to go to that?
I personally probably won't, but we're working on getting reporters credentialed at all of the big places. We've already got our Senate and congressional credentials. So we're certainly planning on all of that, and we want to be in the mix there with all of that. But we also want to step beyond merely what reporters are fed at the press conferences and dig up some stories of our own that we think are important and that sometimes aren't getting covered by the pool coverage.
I guess one of the reasons I asked that is there might be sometimes I'd like to slip a few questions myself to those people. And
so can we recruit you for our Alabama bureau then?
Sure.
Okay, good, good. Well, we're going to call you up on that one, so.
I could. But I was especially thinking about, asking questions, say, at the presidential press conferences in the Senate and House ones, about, say, what is happening with the protection of religious rights in the HHS mandate and other questions that, we talk about, but you don't hear brought up very often in the secular media. And I was wondering if it will be a way to also direct those kinds of issues and questions to the people that are power brokers and help redirect their discourse to be interested in us as well.
Well, certainly we want to have an impact on the national conversation, and generally, in my experience as a journalist, the best way to do that is to break interesting stories that no one else is breaking, the kind of stories that viewers and readers sit up and take notice and get on the phone with their congressman and say, what is going on up there? And
yes.
that's the best way to direct the national conversation on some of these issues. It's also important, I think there's a lot of focus sometimes on the high-profile press briefings, and those are important. But there's a lot going on around here in Senate committees, House committees that people aren't following. And unfortunately, folks, especially those folks concerned with the protection of religious liberty and the protection of the right to life, a lot of these committee meetings are completely under their radar until it's kind of too late. And there's already legislation in motion to do things that, directly contradict fundamental principles, not only of the Catholic faith, but just general principles of defense of human life. And we're seeing that with topics like the right to die movement, yes. Also known as the euthanasia movement. Some of these are just kind of flying under the radar, and they're not getting a lot of mainstream media coverage. Exactly. Perhaps that's a conscious decision, perhaps not. But in any case, those are the kind of committee meetings that are also very important to have a journalist at, sometimes more important because no one else is tracking this stuff. So we want to be there as well, and we want again to be focusing on the issues that matter most to our viewers, but also to be covering those stories that aren't getting a lot of press but should be getting more press.
And that's the kind of thing that could help alert various people who watch us to become more involved in talking to their representatives about very right. important moral issues, again, Catholic morality and constitutional rights are very much going together, and we want to support that mutually and help our people to be more involved in taking their proper rights as citizens to be involved in issues that are going to affect them.
That's right. And I think, as Catholics, we're not afraid of the truth wherever we find it. And that's really the guiding principle, and should be for any newscast, is a focus, an unflinching focus on the truth. And if we are looking for the truth, seeking the truth, and exposing the truth, I think by nature of doing that, we will produce a newscast that is important to Catholics and then to people well beyond the Catholic Church. Because unfortunately, there's a lot of spin in Washington. Washington is famous for its spin doctors and its spin machines. But, we really want this to be a newscast that's focused unflinchingly on the truth. We won't do everything right, but we really do want it to be something that adds some value and brings something brand new to a media landscape that, frankly, is grown stale in some ways. There are a lot of good things happening, but we've also seen that a lot of the old behemoths have sort of fallen, and so sometimes there's kind of a gap, and no one knows what news to trust and what's credible and what's not. And we want to be part of the answer to that, part of standing in that gap and shining a light on truth.
Yeah, a lot of times people do pick up certain news agencies have a lean to the left or to the right, and that they have an agenda that they assume, as you said before, and that's not going to be our approach. Now, will your show be an hour or a half hour?
It'll be a half hour,
Okay.
starting at 6 p.m. Eastern every night, 5 nights a week. And you're right. It's, we're open about the fact that we're Catholic. This is EWTN after all, and that's who we are, and we're proud of it. But this is not a Democrat show. It's not a Republican show. It's not a partisan show. We're not trying to show our version of what we think a Catholic should do or be. We simply want to look at the wider world with a Catholic lens and help our viewers do the same. So that's our agenda, plain and simple, stated up front. And that's really our guiding principle, editorial principle.
All right, so EWTN News Nightly will begin September 3rd of 2013. It will air each weeknight at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, so adjust it to your own time zone. And you can call us with your questions for Colleen at 1-800-221-9460, or if you're local or if you're abroad, you can call 205-271-2980. We'll be right back with your questions and comments. Thank you and welcome back. Now, before I go to our questions and phone calls, I want to remind you that Colleen has a new book, My Sisters, the Saints, a spiritual memoir. It's available through EWTN's religious catalog, along with her other book, The New Faithful, Why Young Adults Are Embracing Christian Orthodoxy, as well as her TV series, Faith and Culture. All you have to do is go to EWTNreligiouscatalog.com, or you can call 1-800-854-6316. And also, we have a nice group of people here in our studio audience from a number of places, Georgia and elsewhere, and we'd love to have you come and join us as well. If you can, please contact our pilgrimage department. They are at 205-271-2966. Or you can also go to www.ewtn.com, and they will give you all kinds of information about places to stay and scheduling for programs, masses, tours of the studios, directions up to Hansville, all that. So do contact them and come and join us. All right, let's start off with a call. We have Margaret on the line. Hello, Margaret.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, where are you from?
Okay, wait a minute.
Are you there?
Is it Margaret?
Yeah, are you Margaret?
Yes, I'm sorry, Father, I didn't hear you. I'm from Wheat Ridge, Colorado. I know it's a little suburb of Denver. You asked me before what that was. I want to ask you, how did the papers get so upset at what Pope said? He didn't say anything bad about the gays. He said everything good. You know, he should have added, I'm only the Pope, not God. Yeah. I don't understand why they got so upset what he said.
All right, do you want to take that, Colleen?
Well, I assume you're talking about the big controversy a few days ago when he talked about who am I to judge when he was speaking about those with homosexual orientation. I mean, what I saw is kind of the typical pattern where the Pope says something pretty simple and it's sort of blown up to create this impression that it's a total change of pace for the church and maybe everything's going to kind of change in the teaching, when really, you know, it is true that we don't individually judge others' hearts or motives, and we're not supposed to. But that's not changing Catholic Church teaching that about the call for chastity. So, you know, I think that was, I think maybe an example of a huge story that perhaps some of the coverage was a little bit skewed or just not quite as justified. And again, I think that's where it can be helpful to have deeper discussions about these stories. You know, what are the true implications of those comments and what are not the implications? What can change in church teaching and what can't? And how should Catholics make sense of this? And again, that's the kind of story that I think we would have probably handled differently. That's not to say all the coverage was wrong, but I think that's where it can help to have that added dimension of just more institutional knowledge about the church and the way it works and papal statements and all the rest of it. Yeah,
I was being questioned about that in local news programs. And one of them said, well, is there anything that you wish would go on? And I say, yes, I wish the press would have been able to pay more attention in their reading classes, you know, so that they could just see what the Pope actually said and don't try to make it something else. It's not silly putty, it's his own words. All right, we have a question from our studio audience. Sir, where are you from?
Jacksonville, Florida.
Good to have you here. And what's your question?
I'd like to ask Ms. Campbell if she would, if she plans to start covering what local Catholics are doing, Catholics in the trenches who are fighting for the church's views on morality, to close down abortories, often succeeding, to fight for the institution of marriage. And often we feel that we are ignored by the larger institutional church. Does she plan to cover what ordinary Catholics are doing to fight for the church?
Right. So what do you respond to, how do you respond to that question?
Well, I think it's absolutely true that a lot of the most important work being done in the church is being done quietly and somewhat anonymously, and often by lay folks who aren't getting a lot of attention, or priests and religious who aren't necessarily making headlines for what they're doing. So those are the sort of slice of life stories we want to contribute. We want this to be a newscast that isn't just eat your spinach. So we want stories that are also positive and uplifting, as well as difficult debates. And we do want to showcase Catholics who are in there doing creative things in the trenches. Sometimes I think there can be a sense of defeatism as Catholics. We are up against it in many ways. Those of us who want to stand with our church on fundamental moral teachings, but in the same vein want to be engaged in the culture. And we don't want to just be defensive and angry all the time. We want to be genuinely, joyfully engaged in a way that attracts others to our faith rather than repelling them. And I do see a lot of just ordinary Catholics starting interesting, creative, inspiring initiatives in their parishes, in their schools, in their neighborhoods. And you're right, a lot of times they just don't get the coverage they deserve. Obviously, our resources aren't unlimited. We can't cover everything. But those slice of life stories are exactly the kind of thing we'd like to bring to our viewers on a regular basis.
Great. That sounds very good. We have another caller. Hello, Ed.
Hi.
Hi, where are you from?
Illinois.
Great. And what's your question?
My comment is that I hope this program will have some very harsh criticism against Hussein Obama and our Secretary of State, then Hillary Clinton, now John Kerry, who say absolutely nothing, no condemnation for the Muslim behavior towards the slaughter of Catholics in the Muslim countries, not only the people, but their churches and their homes.
Okay, thank you, Ed. So, Colleen, what Ed is bringing up is an important issue that all over the Muslim world, Christians are being killed, churches are being burned, and in some places Christians are being strongly harassed. Do you plan to cover some of those stories as well?
We do, and that's part of our partnership with the Associated Press and using those resources to get footage from places we can't necessarily physically be, or at least not always. But, I think that's an important point about the religious persecution that happens around the globe, and too often I think, especially in the United States, we tend to get a little myopic. We focus specifically on the debates going on here, and that's important, that's natural, we live here. But not all of our EWTN viewers live in the United States, and we really want this newscast to have a global perspective and to pay attention to things in a Catholic way. I mean that in a big C way, as in looking at the implications of church teachings and looking at things from a specifically Catholic point of view, but also in the small c Catholic sense of, we're in a universal church, a worldwide church with over 1 billion people, and some of our members are suffering terribly in places. Some of us, we know very little about what they're actually going through, and there's not a lot of media coverage too often of these things. So these are stories, too, we want to bring to our viewers within the resources that we have and draw their attention to it so they can let their elected officials know, hey, we care about this. If you think we're not noticing this, we're noticing, and we expect you to do something about it. But also, of course, as Catholics, to pray for these folks who are our brothers and sisters in Christ and often feel very alone. And unfortunately, sometimes the behavior of us as individuals or even our governments makes them feel more alone. So we want to shine a light of shine the light of truth on what's going on in some of these corners where we're not hearing enough about important stories we need to know about as Catholics and as fellow members of the body of Christ.
A question I also have, another big issue going on in the world that I just see very little covering the issue is that of the rapid growth of slavery around the world, which is now not so much oriented towards, working in fields and such as slaves, but the sexual slave trade, and the stories that there are more slaves now than in 1860. So are you going to cover any of that kind of social concern as well?
We absolutely are. There was a story in the Washington Post, I believe it was this morning, that in Egypt, some girls are, quote unquote, married 60 times before they turn 18. In other words, they're basically sold into prostitution over and over again, but it's given this religious veneer of marriage to make it acceptable to an Islamic culture. Obviously, that wouldn't be acceptable to every Muslim, but it's acceptable to those who are kind of looking to turn a blind eye to this, basically, human trafficking. And obviously, that's not just happening in Egypt. It's happening all around the world. And, too often, I think the secular feminist establishment is so busy fixating on securing and protecting the right to abortion on demand that they haven't noticed that there are a few other things going on that affect women. Obviously, I would take issue at the way they interpret the abortion issue as not a triumph for women, but as a tragedy. But even beyond that issue, we've got the issue of feticide around the world. Baby girls being killed simply because they are baby girls, usually in the womb, sometimes once they're outside the womb. And secular feminist authors in some of these countries have written books on this, and they can't get coverage on the networks, often because, again, it's like the Gosnell story. It just kind of goes against the grain of what we think is a women's concern. But, when you've got baby girls dying because they're baby girls and young girls being sold into prostitution and sexual slavery from the ages of 5 and 10 on up, you have issues like genital mutilation, just terrible stuff that just isn't getting the attention it deserves, the attention that women should be demanding be focused on this, not to mention all of us as Christians. So these, again, are stories that sometimes get short shrift for a variety of reasons, and these are the kinds of stories that concern us.
Good, good. We have another question from our studio audience. Ma'am, where are you from?
I'm from Madison, Georgia.
Good to have you here, and what's your question?
Colleen, with just a half-hour show, will you be able to interview our federal so-called Catholic representatives in Congress and kind of give them the hot seat?
Well, one question is, will they come on with me? So you can start saying a rosary for that one. But you're right. We're, a half an hour is a half an hour. We're going to focus on probably 3 stories that we really tackle more in depth each day, but also bring you the news, a number of other stories so you can keep up with what's going on around the world. But then there are probably about 3 stories a day we're going to really sink our teeth into, bring in interviewees to talk to about them and that sort of thing. So that's kind of the balance of longer stories and shorter stories that we're going to have in this half-hour program. As for, if Vice President Joe Biden wants to come on or Nancy Pelosi and they're willing to answer some straight, tough questions about where they stand on some of these issues where they're in conflict with church teaching, I'd love to have them. I'm not so sure they want to come on, but who knows? So, start praying for that.
All right. We have another caller. Hello, Linda.
Yes, Linda, St. Louis, Missouri.
Good to have you.
Campbell, by the way, your series, your interviews are excellent on faith and culture. My question,
Thank you.
what are the possibilities for your program influencing the secular media there in the hub of news in Washington?
It's a good question. I'd like to think it's going to have an influence. I think we'll be, under the radar at first, probably, as all new programs are. But we hope this will grow into something that will gain attention, whether the other networks want it to or not, and be something where our loyal base of viewers grows to even encompass those who hadn't formally watched EWTN, but say, this is something worth tuning into. And we do believe that, if one news organization takes a sustained, focused, and serious attempt to cover a story that's been neglected by others, in the end, you can often embarrass the others into covering the story as well. And that's sort of what happened with the Gosnell trial. I mean, some of that began with a Twitter campaign by Christian journalist Molly Hemingway and other journalists stepping forward and saying, come on, this is a real story. Why aren't we covering this? And that's the kind of thing that can happen. So, a lot of reporters, as I said at the beginning of the program, yes, some are coming in with a very hard ideological axe to grind, but sometimes they're just coming in not seeing things from anyone else's point of view because, that's the human tendency. You see things your way. And we do hope by bringing some of these stories to the fore that haven't been covered before or not the way we're covering them, we might pique the interest of other journalists, or at the very least, the competitive factor will kick in, and they're going to want to follow a few of these stories too, so they don't look out of the loop. So that would be a great hope for this program. I'm not saying it'll happen on day one, but we sure hope that that would be the effect that this would have over time.
All right. We have another question from our studio audience. Ma'am, where are you from?
I'm from Jacksonville, Florida.
Great town. I love Jacksonville.
Yes, it is.
And what is your question?
Yes, this is kind of a follow-up of what you were just commenting about, Ms. Coleen, and that is, where is the fear in the journalists of the losing integrity in the nation? What kind of accountability do they hold themselves to? And I really want to go back to where they're in school. What kind of principles are they being taught in school? Shouldn't they be having some kind of oath like the doctors have with the Hippocratic Oath? Is there anything that can be done to help new journalists become more principled and even in being objective, even if they're secular or not?
Interesting
Right.
question.
That's a good question. Well, unfortunately, as we know with the Hippocratic Oath, they don't make doctors take that anymore. My husband's a physician, and they had a different kind of oath at his med school. So I wish we had an oath like that for journalists, and I wish we still used the one for doctors. But I will say, I started in journalism and wound up graduating with an English degree. I went to a Jesuit school and wanted the full liberal arts, the philosophy and the theology that I couldn't get if I stuck in the straight journalism track. So I'm more of a liberal arts product in my education than a journalism product. But I will say that a lot of it comes down to some of what they're being taught. But again, it's about a matter of groupthink, the fact that so many people in the profession see the world one way. And so often they're not setting out to downplay their opponent's point of view or to skew stories. Some of them do, and they do sometimes. But a lot of times they just never thought of it from another perspective, because no one in the whole newsroom, all the chains that a story goes through, no one stops and says, hey, did we call up the pro-life side on this question? Or is it really fair to call the pro-lifers the anti-abortion zealots, but over here we're calling the pro-abortion rights crowd the pro-freedom crowd, or the pro-choice? So, a lot of this are just assumptions, and then they get kind of reinforced, and then there's a sense of everyone's doing it, so we do it this way. Everyone calls it this, so we'll call it this. Everyone covers this story and ignores that story, so we better do the same. There's a lot of following the leader, too. And a lot of it, too, comes down to resources. We don't have a lot of time. Let's just do it the easy way and call the usual suspects. So, some of these are just human foibles we all have, but some of this is more intentional. When you see stories buried that you think, come on, if that were happening in a different context on an issue where you didn't have a personal stake in seeing the outcome a certain way, I think you'd want to cover that a little more seriously. So, it's a mix of things, I guess, like all human beings are. We're a mix of the good and the bad and the mistakes and the good intentions and the bad results, and sometimes not so great intentions. But I do think the internet is beginning to change the journalism world. I mean, we're seeing the Washington Post just went on the chopping block the other day, Boston Globe being sold off. So a lot of these big media stars, Newsweek, you know, they're either going out of print or they're getting sold. Bloggers, meanwhile, are keeping journalists on their toes, saying, if you don't write a story about this, I'm going to write about it on my blog and make you look silly for not covering it. So not everything about that is good. I still like the fact-checking that goes into genuine to journalism that's actually done by professionals, but there's the whole role of the mainstream media as the gatekeepers that decide what we're going to find out. That's begun to collapse, and in that sense, that's a healthy thing.
All right, we have another caller. Hello, Deborah.
Hi, I was wondering if there will be an internet presence, a podcast or YouTube, something I can see if I'm not able to be in front of the television at 6 o'clock Eastern Time.
Yeah, where do you live?
Sure, well, we'll certainly... Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Father Mitch.
Oh, I live in Seattle.
Oh, so you would be seeing it, you know, a number of hours, it would be broadcast a number of hours earlier. But we also want to let you know that it will be re-aired at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, but it'll be, which I think is 6 p.m. Pacific Time. So we will have re-airs of it every day. But,
great.
You know, again, you still would like, if possible, the podcast. Will there be such a podcast? Colleen?
You know, I think that's something we're looking into, but obviously the live streaming when it's on, not only the first time, but the second airing is an option. But we certainly do want to have it, you know, on YouTube, available in any format that we can. We're looking into the different ways that we're going to make the show available. And we are going to have a strong internet presence with this show, and not only for us to, you know, for our output, but also for us to hear from viewers. What are the stories you want to see us cover? What's your feedback about how we're doing? So it's going to be a two-way street for us, and that's the exciting thing about the new media is we can really have a conversation and a relationship with our viewers, and it can affect our coverage.
I think that will go back to the question that the gentleman had asked earlier about local stories, that you will get input through the internet as a way to find out what is going on.
Absolutely, and we welcome that. And you know, there's so many stories to be told. We have a big stack of ones we're eager to get to. We can see the news coverage pretty much every day and say, wow, I wish we could do that story this way, or sink our teeth into it a little more, or cover this story that we don't see being covered. So I think we're going to have no shortage of good stories, but we're going to very much welcome our viewer input and our viewers, you know, helping us find those stories that aren't getting the coverage they deserve.
Excellent. We have one more question from our studio audience. Ma'am, where are you from?
I'm from Lilburn, Georgia.
And your question?
Colleen, I was wondering if there's so many Catholics, and I think a lot of people that are just very concerned about what we can do in response to the HHS mandate, the freedom of religion, sanctity of marriage, and all those concerns that are going on right now, and feeling like those in Congress are have a deaf ear to what we're doing. And I was wondering if on your program you will address anything to help those of us who are looking for a way to put things into action, things that maybe programs, different things that are out there for us to do, to bring attention to, and that our voices would be heard from a Catholic perspective and where we stand as far on those topics. Just really wanting to see, maybe, so many people seem to say, well, what can I do?
Right. So, Coleen, will you be able to help people know some of the actions they can take?
Well, having a take-home action piece is actually, I think, very important, always on faith and culture. That's usually my last question to my guests. Okay, well, if this is if this is true, or if viewers agree with you and they want to actually do something, what do? And that's a question I intend to ask a lot of my interviewees on this show as well. What can we actually do where we are, ordinary Catholics, you know? And a lot of times it comes down to obviously writing your letters to the editor and contacting your representatives, but it's also often about being informed and persuasive when you're standing around the water cooler at work or talking over the backyard fence. And that's where I really believe and hope that this program can be one where if you're watching it every night, you're coming away with insights and arguments and facts that you're not finding elsewhere, and you're bringing those back to those conversations, and you're able, in your own sphere of influence, to enlighten others and to persuade others. So I think that's certainly a question that's going to be important in our interviews and an important piece of this newscast.
Well, thank you very much, Colleen. It's been a delight to have you on this program, and we very much look forward to seeing you September 3rd and the days afterwards. And
thank you so much, Father Mitch.
Thank you. Also, I want to remind everybody that you can get Colleen's new book, My Sisters the Saints, a spiritual memoir, at EWTN's Religious Catalog. Just go to EWTNReligiousCatalog.com or call them at 1-800-854-6316. And I started reading it myself, and it's very nicely done. So I hope you get a chance to read it. Well, may Almighty God bless all of you and keep you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. And you know, I remember talking to Mother Angelica about this kind of program back in the 80s. And we will continue to need your support. We couldn't do it back then. We can now. But we'll need you to really keep us in between gas bill, electric bill, and cable bill, because now our bills are going to be going up. So please help us out. Thank you.